Welcome, friends. I'm Beth Stevenson. This is Living Large on Little. Behind me is a picture of the Sea of Galilee taken from the Mount of the Sermon. I took it last December, and today is the Sabbath day, and so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the spiritual underpinnings of food storage, because as I've been working on storing up our harvest and storing up food for long-term storage, I've been thinking about the eventual possibilities of ways that we might need to use all of these resources that we're storing up. And the spiritual motive behind this behavior comes from biblical teachings of Jesus Christ. In the Sermon on the Mount, which is given to us in Matthew 5 through 7, he talks about a description of the judgment day. And in that day, he tells us that he is going to collect the righteous into him. And those are they, he explains, that have fed the hungry and clothed the naked and visited the prisoners. In other words, taken care of the needy, taken care of those who are less fortunate. And there are others that will say, wait a minute, we did wonderful, mighty works in thy name. And he'll say, but you didn't feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And so those of us that have done other things that are good but not cared about those who needed our help, he warns, will be cast off. So Jesus himself was very specific about our obligation to feed the hungry. In another place and time, Jesus taught the parable of the talents. And the way that the story goes is that there was a master of the house, and he was going on a long journey, and he had 3 servants. He gave one of them 5 talents, and one of them 3 talents, and one of them 1 talent. Now, a talent represents a huge amount of money. It was measured in those days as 70 pounds of gold. And so you figure out what the equivalent is. In other words, all of them were very greatly blessed by this generous master. So he went away, the master went away, and when he came back, he made a reckoning with each of his servants. And the first one had put that money to use and spent it on investments and good things, and he had 10 talents to give back to his master. And the second one had also doubled his money, but the third one had not. He was afraid that he might lose it, and so he went and he buried it. And the master said, why didn't you use it for something good? And I could have at least gotten the interest on it. And so he tells him he will be cast off for being a wicked and slothful servant. And that's one thing that I really notice as I study in the New Testament, that the term wicked and slothful are often used together. So slothfulness is offensive to God, and it's something that reminds me when I'm feeling lazy, I don't want to be slothful. And then as far as storing food, specifically, I notice what Jesus himself did. When he was in the wilderness and teaching, he found that there were many, there were 5,000 families that had gathered to hear him talk. And he realized that they were getting hungry. And so he asked around, does anyone have any food? And I think it's remarkable here that he asked someone to provide the beginning of the food before he worked the miracle. Clearly, if he can turn a few loaves and fishes into enough to feed what might have been as many as 15,000 people, then he could have started from nothing. But he didn't. He asked for someone to provide the food. And then he divided it and increased it and performed the miracle. But he wanted to start with the preparation that somebody that was listening to him had already done. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be the lad that it records provided the loaves and fishes? He was the only one in this huge group of people who had thought to bring any food. And yet he gave it to the Lord when he asked for it. And that person who is not named, he's not even noticed, is someone that I've thought about. What would it have taken to have him pull out his basket and say, yeah, I have food, you're welcome to it, and I'm willing to share it. So, so then Jesus fed the 5,000 families then, and then shortly thereafter he fed another 4,000 families in the same type of a miracle. The proportions were a little different, but again, it was fish and bread that somebody had brought. But then he didn't go on feeding them. Can you imagine how popular he would have been if he had just been a gravy train and continued to feed everybody? He could have fed everybody in the whole country, and everybody would have loved him and protected him, but he didn't. He sent them away to go about their business and go take care of the doctrine that they had been learning, put it into their lives, and to provide for themselves. And a lot of people stopped being his disciples when they realized that he wasn't going to feed them anymore. So the idea in my mind that I have heard presented, that God will provide for me when you have an opportunity to provide for yourself and you don't, I think is flawed thinking. Now, all of these things are descriptions of what is Christian behavior, and especially as it relates to food. But I want a story from my own life that has bored into me as a reprimand and also as an example was one day in Istanbul about 4 years ago, where Jeff and I, my husband and I, were walking down a street. We were coming from the most touristy area, and there was a little boy that was huddled in the corner of a building. And he was wearing pants that only went to his knee, and he was wearing a t-shirt, and it was a very chilly day. We were wearing warm coats and wool scarves. And as we approached this little boy, there was a family that was walking ahead of us, and they were in the traditional Muslim clothing, and they were pushing a stroller. The man was pushing a stroller with two little boys that were all bundled up in there. And the man who was walking ahead of us noticed this little boy about the same time that I did. And he talked to him, and he asked him apparently what he was doing out there in the cold. He was not begging, he was just huddled there in the corner. And the little boy answered him, and of course they were speaking in Turkish, I assume, and so I don't know what they said exactly. But then the man sounded like he was kind of scolding the little boy, and he took a blanket from the stroller, a nice warm fuzzy blanket, and he wrapped the little boy in this warm blanket, and then he would continue to question him. And so then after that he took him into a shop there that was selling nuts and candies and some basic groceries. And he walked him in there, and I am certain that he had taken him in to give him some food, buy him some food. And I was so impressed that the man noticed this little boy. It was very obvious that he was not the same race.
Hi, Amy.
Hello.
Downstairs.
It was very obvious that he wasn't the same race, but he wanted to help this person who was in obvious need. So those are the spiritual underpinnings of storing food. We may be called upon to help our neighbors. I have heard people say that they store ammunition instead of food, and I think that's a little bit alarming, and I don't think it's compatible with Christian behavior. What if this worldwide pandemic is like Pharaoh's dream in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, where he gave them a warning of what was to come. And so he gave them a period of time to prepare. And they did. They filled their storehouses to bursting, and then they were able to feed the whole region when the famine came. If there is another more serious pandemic on the horizon for us, now is the time for us to prepare, to use the lessons that we've learned, that we may not be able to leave our homes. The food supply chain may be broken because transportation is stopped for some reason. It doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could be a natural disaster like an earthquake or floods or fires or whatever. All of the disasters that are increasing around us, any one of them could interrupt our food chain and put us in a position where we need to provide for ourselves first, and then be in a position to help those who can't help themselves. So take it for what it's worth, but that's what's been on my mind. Thanks for watching.